But what is a foreign fighter? The thing to note is that this is a relatively new concept. You don't find it in the academic literature before the early 2000s. So there is still some conceptual work to be done in this field, but work by myself and a scholar named David Mallet has tried to narrow down or to pin down a definition of foreign fighters. The first thing we can do when we start thinking about foreign fighters is to think of it as an intermediary category between two types of conflict actors that are very familiar from the international relations literature. You have insurgents on the one hand and international terrorists on the one hand. And insurgents, in a nutshell, operate locally and they use guerrilla tactics. International terrorists, on the other hand, operate transnationally and use terrorist tactics. Now, foreign fighters take one element of each. So they operate transnationally, but they use primarily guerrilla tactics. So they move like international terrorists, but they fight like insurgents. But we can narrow it down further with four key criteria. One is that foreign fighters are typically private actors, and that sets them apart from deployed soldiers. They're also typically unpaid or receive a very low pay, which sets them apart from mercenaries who go out and fight for money. And third, they're not from the conflict area that they're fighting in, and this sets them apart from traditional insurgents who are typically sort of born and raised in the place they fight. And fourth and finally, they fight like insurgents. They typically engage primarily in guerrilla type activity, and in that respect they differ from international terrorists. But as many concepts in social science, the borders around this concept are not always crystal clear. There are some borderline phenomena that can be difficult to classify as foreign fighter or not. And I'll mention some examples. First, you have the case of diaspora volunteers. For example, Somali Americans who go and fight in Somalia, for example. They may be raised in the United States, but they have a family connection to the conflict they're joining. So they're the one criteria about not being from the conflict area is blurred. Another borderline phenomenon is ideological volunteers to foreign militaries. For example, every year many non-Jewish Europeans travel to Israel to serve in the Israel Defense Forces, usually for ideological reasons. Now, this is also a borderline case because the IDF is not an insurgent organization, but at the same time there's ideology motivating the volunteers. A third borderline phenomenon is terrorist trainees. That is, for example, European Islamists who travel to Pakistan to train with Al-Qaeda Central. Some of them may leave with the intention to fight in Afghanistan as insurgents, but they end up basically training for international terrorism. Now that poses a definitional question: should we see them as foreign fighters or as international terrorists? And a fourth borderline phenomenon are volunteers in non-combat roles. In many foreign fighter destinations, you see foreign volunteers arriving and doing things other than fighting. They may serve as aid workers or help with logistics and so on. And that poses a question whether you should count them as foreign fighters or not. There are no clear answers to these questions. And in different commentators, analysts and scholars will classify individual groups of activists differently depending on how the stance they take on these borderline cases. I want to say a few words about how we study foreign fighters. One thing we who study foreign fighters is try to estimate the numbers of foreign fighters in a given conflict or from a particular departure country. And that's a very difficult exercise because you very rarely have rosters of foreign fighters or archives with lists of names and so on. So you have to work with what little we have, and typically you can find numerical observations in primary and secondary sources. For example, a foreign fighter may write a memoir later on, where he says, "Oh, I think I saw about 300 foreign fighters in this region." Then you can note that observation. And if you aggregate numerical observations like this, you can get to some kind of estimate for a given conflict. What we also often do is try and assess try and get a sense of the profile of the foreign fighters who joined and their role in the insurgency. And for that, we typically turn to primary sources, memoirs of ex-foreign fighters, propaganda material from the conflict while it rages, and so on and so forth. I also want to mention that there are some data sets available. There's only one sort of global data set for foreign fighter contingents across the world and across history, and that's David Mallay's data set. And I myself have developed another much smaller one for Islamist foreign fighter contingents. But on the whole, we don't have very good data for global data for the foreign fighter phenomenon over time. And we also have some limited profile data sets, but they're typically either destination specific. So someone will write an article about the foreign fighters in destination X, let's say Iraq or Chechnya, or they will be departure country specific. So I, for example, wrote an article about Saudi foreign fighters in Iraq, and others have recently written articles about and created data sets for, let's say, the British foreign fighters in Syria and so on. You have narrow data sets, but you don't have any good profile data sets for foreign fighters.